Many of us probably think that humans are everywhere on this planet. There are billions of us, and it seems like everywhere you look there are other people, and there is no wild or wilderness left in the world with everything being already discovered. But this is simply not the case. The world is an enormous place, and there are still places just as remote and far away as they were thousands of years ago. So then, how far away exactly can you possibly get from every other human on the planet? For the maximum terror factor, let's imagine that you have suddenly been teleported to the following locations, and then imagine how or if you would escape. Perhaps you still want to be around a few people but far away from everybody else in the world, in which case you would likely want to visit the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is the most remote place in the world that is actually inhabited by people. The tiny island has a tiny population of just 264 people, and while you're there, the closest other population of humans will be located 2,000 kilometers away on the island of St. Helena, which itself is quite remote. The nearest continent to you would be Africa, which would be a staggering 2,400 kilometers away. There is no airport on the island, so the only way to or from is by boat, and boats only come from South Africa about 8 or 9 times in an entire year. If you really want off the island, then you better have your own boat, and even then, the shortest journey to the nearest airport on Ascension Island would take you 7 days to reach. Now let's next imagine that you are placed in the center of Devon Island, which is part of the Canadian archipelago. This island is roughly the same size as Croatia, and yet it has absolutely 0 people living on it. Nobody. It's just you and complete solitude with nobody else as far as the land goes. Walk in any direction and you will never find anybody else to help you. The closest other humans to you would be here on the island next door in the town of Resolute, population 229, which is every single person who lives on the island. But even still, the town is 80 kilometers away from the island that you're on, and you would need a boat to get there. Maybe you think that the South Pole would have to be one of the most remote and far away places in the world, and while that used to be true, the South Pole today is home to a permanent research station that is always staffed by as many as 150 scientists. The place in Antarctica that is far more remote and difficult to get to or out of would be this exact spot here, which is the furthest point on the continent away from the ocean. It is located 878 kilometers away from the research station at the South Pole, which would be the nearest other humans to your location. You may find some solace that there is at least already shelter pre-built here, although most of it has been buried under the snow. The Soviets first reached this place in 1958, and built a bust of Lenin facing towards Moscow, which is the only thing that still stands today above the snow, gazing into the vast nothingness in every direction. The last time that humans ever visited this point was back in 2011, so unless you want to wait around for years to be rescued, then you should probably get moving to that South Pole research station. However, this isn't the most remote piece of land on Earth. That distinction has to go to this island in the South Atlantic called Bouvet Island. It is small, frozen with ice, and completely uninhabited by all of humanity, although Norway claims it for herself for some unknown reason. The nearest other piece of land to you would be Queen Maud Land here off the coast of Antarctica at 1,600 kilometers away, but that island is also uninhabited, so there's no use going there. The nearest other humans to you on Bouvet Island would be 2,260 kilometers away on Tristan da Cunha, which, as we previously discussed, is also incredibly remote in its own right. For reference, that distance would be about 54% of the distance from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, with no other humans in sight, and just to arrive at the most remote inhabited place on Earth that still has no airport and that only has boats come to it 8 or 9 times a year. So far, we've only been talking about being on land, but we haven't yet considered the ocean. If we forget about distance and just think about the sheer obstacles between you and every other person, then the bottom of the Marianas Trench nearly 11 kilometers below the ocean's surface would be a truly lonely place. Only 3 people have ever been to the bottom in all of human history, and the last time was in 2012. Strangely, that does mean that there have been 4 times as many people that have been on the surface of the moon than have been to the bottom of the ocean. But let's take it back to distance for a moment, because the ocean is truly gargantuan and far bigger than many of us realize. This point in the Arctic Ocean, for example, is the furthest point in that ocean away from any land. It is located on a shifting pack of ice, so a permanent structure is impossible to build. If you were to ever reach here, the closest inhabited land would be Ellesmere Island in Canada, home to a population of only 146 people. The closest actual settlement on that island, Grijsfjord, would be 1,600 38 kilometers away from you at this point. Further, nobody has actually ever reached this point yet in all of history, so if you want to become an explorer and put your name down in the history books alongside Magellan, then get out there and reach it first. And finally, and most terrifying of all, the most remote point and furthest away from the rest of humanity that you can likely ever achieve is deep in the Pacific Ocean, which for reference on a globe looks like this and almost takes up half of everything you see. This exact point here is known as Point Nemo and is by far the most remote place on the planet. The closest inhabited land to you at this point would be Easter Island, which is a mind-boggling 2,689 kilometers away. To put that into perspective again, that is about 64% of the distance from the US West Coast to East Coast, with not a single other person and just vast, empty ocean. If you think that possibly some shipping routes or cargo ships may pass by to help, then here is a map of what these trade routes look like. Notice the dark points around not only here, but also the point that we discussed earlier in the Arctic Ocean and Bouvet Island over here. The record for the fastest time that anybody has ever made it to Point Nemo was on a boat, and it still took 15 days, 10 hours, and 37 minutes to reach, plus all of that time to make it back from where they originated from. It's weird to think that if you were at this point sitting in a boat alone, the closest other humans to you would actually be the astronauts on board the International Space Station as they occasionally orbit the Earth above you. The station orbits at a maximum of 416 kilometers above the Earth's surface, which is far closer than the 2,689 kilometers needed to reach Easter Island. In fact, the space station would be the closest humans to you at several of these other locations as well, but here especially if you were stranded then they would be too far away for help. The fastest anybody could possibly reach you would take over 15 days, the closest help you could get yourself would be the same as venturing nearly 2/3 of the way across the United States, and to top everything off, the Lovecraftian city of R'lyeh is located not too far away from this point, so you may have far worse things than sheer isolation to worry about at this point.